James Adele walked into the courtroom that morning with a smile that could cut glass. She had the best lawyer's money could buy, a forged deed that looked perfect, and a plan to destroy the woman sitting across from her. She thought she had already won. She thought the gavel was just a formality. But she forgot one thing. In the game of high-stakes real estate, the devil isn't in the details, it's in the fine print. When Judge Graves leaned forward and asked her just one simple question about ownership, the color drained from her face, and the entire courtroom gasped. You won't believe how this billionaire heiress lost everything in a single second. The air in the Superior Court of King County, Seattle, was usually stale and smelled of floor wax and anxiety. But today, to James Adele, it smelled like expensive perfume and impending victory. James checked her reflection in the glass of the courtroom doors before pushing them open. She adjusted the collar of her crimson Chanel blazer. It was a power color. She wanted Sarah to see red the moment she walked in. "Are we ready, Mr. Prescott?" she asked, her voice low and smooth, like silk dragged over gravel. Her lawyer, Leonard Prescott, a man whose hourly rate could feed a family of 4 for a month, nodded smugly. He adjusted his gold-rimmed glasses. "It's a slam dunk, Miss Adele. The eviction notice was filed correctly, the deed transfer is recorded, and the opposing counsel is, well, let's just say she's out of her depth." James smirked. "Good. I want that eyesore of a bakery leveled by Friday. My architects are already waiting to break ground on the Adele Tower." They walked down the center aisle, their heels clicking in a rhythmic, intimidating beat on the hardwood floor. Heads turned. Whispers followed. James Adele wasn't just a developer. She was a shark in a city of minnows. She had spent the last 5 years aggressively acquiring every property on 4th Avenue, turning historic brick buildings into glass and steel monuments to her own ego. There was only one holdout. Miller's Hearth, a 90-year-old bakery that smelled of yeast and cinnamon, sitting stubbornly right in the middle of her proposed lobby. James glanced at the defense table. Sarah Miller sat there, looking small and tired. She was wearing a gray cardigan that had seen better days and had her hair pulled back in a messy bun. She looked like exactly what she was, a woman who had spent her life kneading dough at 3 a.m., while James spent hers brokering mergers. Sitting next to Sarah was her lawyer, a young woman named Emily Halloway. She looked like she was barely out of law school, nervously shuffling papers and dropping a pen. James laughed softly. "Look at them, Leonard. It's pathetic. Why didn't she just take the buyout offer? She could have retired to Florida." "Pride, Miss Adele," Prescott sneered. "Poor people cling to it when they have nothing else. We'll relieve her of it soon enough." "All rise," the bailiff bellowed. The door behind the bench opened, and Judge Silas Graves swept into the room. Graves was a legend in the circuit, a man in his late 60s with a face carved from granite and eyes that seemed to see through every lie ever told in his courtroom. He didn't tolerate theatrics, and he famously hated wasting time. James felt a thrill of anticipation. Graves was harsh, but he was a stickler for the law, and the law, thanks to Prescott's creative maneuvering, was on her side. "Docket number 4592, the clerk announced. Adele Development versus Sarah Miller. Regarding the property at 402 4th Avenue. Judge Graves sat down, arranging his robes. He peered over his reading glasses at the two tables. "Mr. Prescott," he rumbled. "You represent the plaintiff?" "Yes, Your Honor," Prescott said, standing up and buttoning his jacket. "We are here to enforce a legal eviction based on the rightful ownership of the property in question." "And Miss Halloway for the defense?" The young lawyer stood up. Her voice was steady, but quiet. "Yes, Your Honor." "Very well," Graves said, leaning back. "Opening statements. Make them brief." "I have a full docket today." James leaned back in her chair, crossing her legs. She watched Sarah's shoulders slump. "Don't worry, darling," James thought. "It'll all be over soon." Leonard Prescott didn't walk to the podium. He strutted. He placed a thick binder on the stand and opened it with a flourish. "Your Honor," Prescott began, his voice booming for the benefit of the gallery, "this case is simple. It is about progress versus stubbornness. It is about legal title versus sentimental delusion." He gestured toward James. "My client, James Adele, CEO of Adele Development, purchased the debt liabilities of the property at 402 4th Avenue 3 months ago. The previous owner, Sarah Miller's late father, took out a substantial private loan in 1998 to renovate the bakery, a loan he never paid back. James suppressed a smile. This was the masterstroke. They hadn't bought the building directly. Sarah would never have sold. Instead, they had hunted down the old, obscure financial records of her father, found a private lender he had borrowed from decades ago, and bought the debt. According to the contract signed by Mr. Miller, Prescott continued, holding up a yellowed document encased in plastic. Failure to repay the principal resulted in the forfeiture of the property collateral. That collateral is the building. My client now holds the note. We have demanded payment. Miss Miller cannot pay. Therefore, the property belongs to Adele Development. He paused for effect. We offered Miss Miller a generous relocation package. She refused. We gave her 60 days to vacate. She refused. We are simply asking the court to enforce the contract signed by her own father. Prescott turned to look at Sarah. It is tragic, certainly. But the law is not a charity, Your Honor. Contracts must be honored. Judge Graves looked at the document. And you have the original loan agreement? We do, Your Honor. Authenticated and notarized. Miss Holloway? The judge turned his gaze to the defense. Does your client dispute the debt? Sarah's young lawyer stood up. She didn't have Prescott's swagger. She looked like a high school librarian. Your Honor, Miss Holloway said softly, we do not dispute that a loan was taken out in 1998. James let out a short, sharp breath of relief. That was it. If they admitted the debt existed, they were dead in the water. Sarah couldn't afford the $3 million in compounded interest. However, Holloway continued, we dispute the plaintiff's claim that buying the debt grants them the right to seize the property today. Prescott chuckled audibly. It's a standard forfeiture clause, Your Honor. It's right there in black and white. Judge Graves raised a hand to silence Prescott. Let her finish. Holloway picked up a single piece of paper. We believe the plaintiff has overlooked a critical detail in the history of the land itself. Miss Adele has been very thorough in purchasing the debt of the business, Miller's Bakery, but she seems to have confused the business with the property. James frowned. What was she talking about? It was the same thing. Her team had checked the city registry. The building was listed under Miller's name. Mr. Prescott, the judge said, did your due diligence confirm the asset structure? Absolutely, Prescott scoffed. The building is the primary asset of the business. The business defaulted. We own the business's debts. We own the building. This is desperate grasping at straws, Your Honor. James leaned over to whisper to Prescott. Stop arguing with the girl and just show the foreclosure deed. Prescott nodded. Your Honor, to expedite this, I would like to enter into evidence. Exhibit B, the foreclosure deed filed last week with the county clerk. It legally transfers the title to Adele Development. The bailiff took the document and handed it to the judge. Graves adjusted his glasses and read it silently. The room was so quiet you could hear the hum of the air conditioning. Sarah Miller hadn't looked up once. She was staring at her hands, which were clasped tightly on the table. James felt a flicker of annoyance. Look at me, she urged silently. I want to see you cry. The deed seems in order, Judge Graves said finally. He looked at Sarah. Miss Miller, I understand this is your family home and business, but if the debt is valid and the collateral was the property. Sarah finally looked up. Her eyes weren't filled with tears, as James had expected. They were filled with a strange, burning anger. It wasn't his to give, Sarah said. Her voice was raspy but loud enough to be heard. Objection, Prescott barked. The defendant is testifying without being sworn in. Overruled, Graves said, his eyes narrowing. What did you say, Miss Miller? Sarah stood up, ignoring her lawyer's hand on her arm. My father, he was a good man, but he was a gambler. That loan, he took it out to pay off debts he didn't want my mother to know about. He signed the bakery over as collateral because he thought he'd win the money back before anyone noticed. She looked straight at James. You think you're smart, don't you? Digging up my father's mistakes to steal my life? James smiled coldly. I'm not stealing anything, honey. I'm collecting. Miss Miller, the judge interrupted sternly. Emotional appeals will not change the facts of the contract. Did your father own the building in 1998? Yes, Sarah said. He owned the building. Then he had the right to use it as collateral, Graves said, reaching for his gavel. I'm afraid I see no legal ambiguity here. Mr. Prescott, your motion for summary eviction is— Wait, Miss Holloway interrupted. It was the first time she had raised her voice. Your Honor, please. Before you rule, you need to see one more document. It wasn't in the digital discovery because it predates the digital system. Prescott rolled his eyes. Oh, come on. A surprise document? This isn't a TV show. This is my courtroom, Mr. Prescott, Graves snapped. I'll decide what is admissible. What do you have, Miss Holloway? Holloway pulled a large, crumbling piece of parchment from a protective plastic sleeve. It looked ancient. The edges were burnt orange with age, and the handwriting was an elegant, old-fashioned script. This, Holloway said, walking it up to the bench, is the original land grant for the plot at 402 4th Avenue, dated 1924. James felt a sudden, cold prickle on the back of her neck. Land grant? Who cared about a paper from 1924? They had the digital title. Judge Graves took the document. He handled it carefully. He read the header, and his eyebrows shot up. Miss Holloway, the judge said slowly. Where did you find this? In a safety deposit box my client's grandmother left her, Holloway said. We only found the key 2 days ago. And what is the relevance? Prescott demanded, clearly annoyed. A 1924 deed doesn't negate a 1998 lien. It does, Holloway said, turning to face the arrogant lawyer. If the 1924 deed contains a restrictive covenant of perpetual stewardship. The room went silent. James leaned toward Prescott. What the hell is a perpetual stewardship? She hissed. Prescott looked suddenly pale. Sweat beaded on his upper lip. It's an old law, very rare. It basically means— It means, Judge Graves interrupted, his voice booming, that the land cannot be sold, mortgaged, or transferred as collateral without the express written consent of the original trust's board of directors. If such a clause exists, Mr. Miller never had the legal right to use the building as collateral in 1998. The loan was unsecured. The lien is void. James felt the floor drop out from under her. Void? She screeched, standing up. I paid $3 million for that debt. Sit down, Miss Adele, Graves barked. He turned his attention back to the parchment. He pulled a magnifying glass from his drawer. The tension in the room was thick enough to choke on. James watched the judge's eyes scan the faded ink. If that clause was there, her foreclosure was illegal. She wouldn't just lose the building. She'd lose the $3 million she paid for the bad debt. I see the clause, Graves said finally. Paragraph 4. The earth beneath these walls shall remain in the trust of the Miller bloodline to serve the community, and shall not be encumbered by the debts of men. Sarah let out a sob of relief. But Prescott wasn't done. He was cornered, and like a rat, he bit back. Your Honor, Prescott shouted. That document is 100 years old. It hasn't been filed in the modern registry. You cannot uphold a ghost document over a registered digital title. My client bought this in good faith, relying on the public record. The law protects good faith purchasers. Judge Graves paused. He looked at Prescott, then at James. That is true, the judge admitted. The failure to update the registry lies with the Miller family. If Miss Adele acted in good faith, unaware of this hidden restriction, the court might be inclined to grant her an equitable lien. James's heart started beating again. Yes, the loophole. Good faith. She didn't know about the covenant. She was innocent. We demand the eviction proceed, Prescott said, regaining his confidence. We didn't know. We couldn't have known. Judge Graves looked at James. His eyes were dark, unreadable pools. He wasn't looking at the papers anymore. He was looking at her. Miss Adele, the judge said softly, you are a very experienced developer, are you not? James stood, smoothing her skirt. I am, Your Honor, the best in the city. And you have a team of researchers, historians, analysts? I employ the best firm in the state, she said proudly. So, Graves said, leaning forward, clasping his hands, you are telling this court that in all your research, in all your due diligence, to acquire this historic property, you never once came across the history of the Miller Trust? Never, James lied. She said it smoothly, perfectly. Graves stared at her for a long, uncomfortable minute. Then he looked at Sarah's lawyer. Miss Holloway, the judge said, do you have any evidence that the plaintiff knew about this restriction? Holloway bit her lip. No, Your Honor, only the document itself. Then I am in a bind, Graves said. I have a valid ancient deed, but a modern purchaser who claims ignorance. The law favors the modern record unless fraud can be proven. James smiled. She had won. She had actually won. However, Judge Graves said, and the word hung in the air like a guillotine blade, there is one thing that bothers me. He picked up the foreclosure deed James's team had filed. Miss Adele, the judge asked, you bought the debt, correct? Yes, Your Honor. And then you filed this deed to transfer the title to yourself? Yes. I have a question, the judge said. One simple question about ownership. James felt a flicker of unease. Ask away, Your Honor. Judge Graves held up the paper. You filed this deed, claiming ownership of the structure and improvements at 402 4th Avenue. That is the standard language for a building. He paused, his eyes locking onto hers. But my question is, did you buy the land? The courtroom was silent, suspended in that breathless moment before a car crash. James Adele stared at Judge Graves, her brow furrowing just slightly. It was the only crack in her armor. The land? James repeated, her laugh nervous and sharp. Your Honor, I bought the property. In real estate, the property is the land. You can't buy a building without the ground it sits on. That's physics. Judge Graves didn't smile. He leaned back in his leather chair, steepling his fingers. In 99% of cases, you would be right, Miss Adele. But you are not in a standard real estate transaction. You are in a case involving a severed estate. Leonard Prescott, James's high-priced shark of a lawyer, suddenly dropped his pen. It clattered loudly on the table. He scrambled to grab the old one. 1924 deed. His hands shaking as he read the bottom paragraph again. Oh no, Prescott whispered. Oh, God. What? James hissed, grabbing his arm. What is it? Miss Adele. Judge Graves's voice boomed, filling the room. The deed from 1924 established a ground leases structure. The Miller Trust, meaning Sarah Miller's family, retained the fee simple ownership of the earth itself. The building, the bricks, the mortar, the roof, that was legally separated as a leasehold improvement. When you bought the debt, you bought the rights to the structure. The judge took off his glasses. Congratulations, Miss Adele. You are now the proud owner of a 2-story brick building. However, you do not own the dirt it sits on. Miss Miller does. James stared at him, her mind racing. So? I'll buy the land. I'll condemn it. You can't. Sarah's young lawyer, Emily Holloway, spoke up. She was standing straighter now, a flush of excitement on her cheeks. The stewardship clause forbids the sale of the land. It must remain in the Miller family. Judge Graves nodded. Exactly. And since Miss Adele now owns the building but not the land, she is essentially a tenant. And Miss Miller is the landlord. The color drained from James's face. She looked at Sarah, who was sitting there, stunned, processing the information. So, James stammered, what does that mean? It means, Judge Graves said, a gleam of amusement in his eyes, that you have a very large, very heavy building parked on Miss Miller's lawn. And I imagine she might want to charge you rent. Sarah stood up slowly. She looked at James, then at the judge. Rent? She asked softly. Ground rent, Graves confirmed. Market value. Sarah turned to James. The fear was gone from her eyes, replaced by a cold, calculating look that James recognized. It was the same look she used in boardrooms. The market value for commercial ground space in downtown Seattle, Sarah said, her voice gaining strength. Especially on 4th Avenue. It's expensive. James slammed her hand on the table. This is ridiculous. I own the building. I can demolish it. Actually, Emily Holloway interjected. The lease agreement attached to the 1,924 deed stipulates that any demolition requires the ground owner's permission. If you touch one brick without Sarah's say-so, you are liable for damages to the aesthetic integrity of her land. James felt like she was suffocating. She owned a building she couldn't tear down, sitting on land she couldn't buy, owned by a woman she had tried to destroy. Court is adjourned until the parties can negotiate a lease agreement, Judge Graves said, banging the gavel. I suggest you be polite, Miss Adele. Your building is trespassing. The meeting in the conference room of Prescott, Lewis and Hamline, one of Seattle's most prestigious law firms, was tense. James paced the length of the room, looking out the window at the city she usually dominated. Fix this, Leonard, she snarled. I am not paying that baker rent. Leonard Prescott was sweating. He had loosened his tie and was frantically scrolling through case law on his tablet. James, the precedent is rock solid. It's called a land lease. It happens in New York and London all the time. The Empire State Building sits on leased land. But usually, the terms are set for 99 years. Here, the lease expired when the debt defaulted. We are technically squatters. Squatters? James threw a crystal glass paperweight against the wall. It shattered. I am a billionaire. I am not a squatter. She took a deep breath and smoothed her hair. Fine. If we can't evict her legally, we'll do it practically. She owns the land? Fine. But I own the building. And I own the utilities connected to the building structure. Leonard looked up. What are you thinking? The bakery needs electricity to run the ovens, right? It needs water for the dough. The meters are attached to my building. James smiled, a cruel, razor-thin expression. Cut them. James, that's constructive eviction. It's illegal. Only if she's a residential tenant, James countered. This is a commercial dispute between two asset owners. If I want to do maintenance on my electrical wiring in my building, that's my right. If that maintenance takes, 6 months, that's just unfortunate. The next day, the war began. Sarah arrived at Miller's Hearth at 4 a.m. to start the sourdough. She unlocked the back door, flipped the light switch, and nothing. She tried the ovens. Cold. She turned the faucet. A dry rattle. She ran outside. There was a chain-link fence erected around the perimeter of the building right up to the edge of the sidewalk. A massive sign read, Danger. Asbestos abatement in progress. Keep out. Property of Adele Development. A security guard in a black uniform stood by the gate. He was built like a tank and wore sunglasses in the dark. Excuse me, Sarah shouted. I need to get in. My business is in there. The guard didn't move. Building is closed for safety repairs, ma'am. Owner's orders. No entry. I own the land, Sarah screamed, waving her court papers. I don't know about the dirt, lady, the guard grunted. But the door you're trying to open is attached to the wall. And the wall belongs to Miss Adele. Don't touch it. Sarah stood there, shivering in the cold morning mist. She pulled out her phone and called Emily. They locked me out, Sarah said, her voice trembling. They put up a fence. By noon, it was all over the local news. Seattle Chronicle ran the headline, Billionaire Bullies, Beloved Bakery. But James didn't care about bad press. She cared about results. Inside her penthouse office, James watched the news feed. Let them cry, she told Leonard. She can't make money if she can't bake. She has no savings. She'll starve before the court can schedule a hearing for the utility dispute. She'll come crawling to me by Friday begging to sell the land for pennies. But James made a miscalculation. She assumed Sarah was alone. On Wednesday, 2 days into the siege, a black SUV pulled up to the construction fence. A man stepped out. He wasn't a lawyer. He wasn't a reporter. He was older, dressed in a tailored Italian suit, leaning on a cane with a silver handle. He walked right up to the security guard. "Move," the man said. His voice was quiet but carried the weight of a sledgehammer. "Restricted area," the guard said, puffing his chest. The man smiled. He pulled out a card and handed it to the guard. The guard looked at it, and his eyes went wide. He stepped aside immediately. The man walked over to Sarah, who was sitting on the curb, head in her hands. "Sarah Miller?" he asked. Sarah looked up. "Yes? My name is Arthur Pendleton," the man said. "I used to buy a cinnamon roll from your father every morning in 1985 before I made my first million. This bakery is the only honest thing left in this city." He pointed his cane at the Adele Development Tower across the street. "That woman thinks she can starve you out? She forgot that a bakery feeds the community. And the community feeds it back." Arthur turned to the crowd that had gathered. "I am parking my food truck fleet here. Free generators, free water tanks. If James Adele wants a siege, we'll give her a war." Within hours, Miller's Hearth was operational again. Extension cords snaked from neighboring buildings, businesses that hated James's aggressive tactics. A portable water tank was hooked up to the back. Sarah baked, and the people came. The line for her bread went around the block. It became a symbol of resistance. People weren't just buying bread, they were buying a piece of the fight. James watched from her window, her face turning purple. She's stealing my electricity." "Technically," Leonard sighed. "It's the coffee shop next door's electricity. They donated it." "Find a way," James hissed. "Destroy her." 3 weeks into the bakery siege, the situation on 4th Avenue had devolved into a spectacle that the city of Seattle could not ignore. What had started as a simple eviction dispute had transformed into a cultural war zone. James Adele stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of her penthouse office, staring down at the street below. She gripped her crystal tumbler so hard her knuckles turned white. From 40 stories up, she could still see the chaos. Miller's Hearth was no longer just a bakery. It was a fortress of flour and yeast. The blockade she had ordered, the chain-link fences, the security guards, the intimidation tactics had backfired spectacularly. Instead of starving Sarah Miller out, James had inadvertently turned her into a folk hero. The bakery was running on massive industrial generators, donated by a local tech billionaire who hated James's development policies. A hose ran from the coffee shop next door to provide water. The smell of fresh sourdough bread didn't just stay on the street. It seemed to drift upward, mocking James even in her climate-controlled office. "She's winning the PR war, James," Leonard Prescott said from the leather couch behind her. He sounded exhausted. "The Seattle Chronicle just ran a cartoon of you. They drew you as a dragon hoarding gold while a peasant throws a baguette at your head. It's unflattering." "I don't care about cartoons, Leonard," James snapped, turning around. Her eyes were rimmed with red. She hadn't slept properly in days. "I care about my stock price. Adele Development is down 6%. My board is calling for a vote of no confidence. If I don't break that woman by the end of the month, I lose the tower project. And if I lose the tower, I lose everything." She walked over to the massive conference table, which was covered in blueprints, court transcripts, and ancient maps. She swept a stack of papers onto the floor in a sudden burst of rage. "There has to be a way," she hissed. "No contract is perfect. No deed is bulletproof. There is always a crack. Find it." Leonard sighed, picking up a magnifying glass. "We've been over the 1,924 land grant 100 times. The stewardship clause is ironclad. As long as she operates the bakery, the land is hers." James froze. She looked at Leonard, her eyes narrowing. "Say that again." Leonard blinked. "The stewardship clause? It says the land must remain in the Miller family." "No, the other part," James said, walking slowly toward him. "As long as she operates." She snatched the crumbling parchment of the original deed from the table. She ignored the main paragraphs and focused on the fine print at the very bottom, the addendums added by the original trust lawyers to prevent the land from becoming an eyesore. She grabbed the magnifying glass and leaned in, scanning the faded calligraphy until she found it. Clause 14b. The condition of active stewardship. The privilege of the trust is granted solely for the benefit of the community. Should the land remain fallow, or the commercial enterprise upon it cease to operate for a period of 30 continuous days, the stewardship shall be deemed abandoned, and the title to the land shall revert to the municipal authority for immediate public auction. James read it twice. Then she read it a third time. A slow, predatory smile spread across her face. 30 days, she whispered. What? Leonard asked, leaning over. If the business stops operating for 30 days, James said, her voice trembling with excitement. The trust is void. The land goes to auction. Leonard frowned. But she is operating. She's baking more bread than ever. You can't stop her unless you physically board up the building, and the judge already warned us against constructive eviction. I can't board it up, James agreed, walking back to her desk and picking up her phone. But the city of Seattle can. She scrolled through her contacts until she found the number for Gary Thorne, the chief health inspector. Gary was a man who enjoyed expensive golf trips and had a nephew who had miraculously gotten into a prestigious private school after James made a generous donation to the building fund. Gary owed her. James? Gary's voice was nervous when he answered. I saw the news. Things look intense over there. Gary, James said, her voice sweet and poisonous. I'm looking at the drone footage of that bakery on 4th Avenue. It's a mess. Extension cords running through puddles? Water hoses connected to unverified sources? Tell me, surely that violates half a dozen health and safety codes? Well, Gary hesitated. It's a bit irregular, sure. But given the circumstances, we've been lenient. The public support for her is... I don't pay you for leniency, Gary. James cut him off, her tone turning icy. I'm worried about public safety. If that place catches fire because of faulty wiring, or if someone gets sick from contaminated water, that's on you. It's on your department. Do you want a negligence lawsuit on your record right before your retirement? There was a long silence on the other end. What do you want me to do, James? I want you to do your job, she said. Go down there, find a violation, a big one, and shut it down. Not a warning, Gary. A red tag. Immediate closure. Tonight, at 9 p.m. that evening, the lights of Miller's hearth were blazing. Sarah Miller was exhausted but happy, pulling a fresh tray of cinnamon rolls from the oven while a line of customers waited outside. Suddenly, the flashing red and blue lights of city vehicles cut through the night. 3 white vans, emblazoned with Department of Health and Safety, screeched to a halt in front of the bakery. Gary Thorne stepped out, flanked by 4 officers. He didn't look at Sarah. He looked at his clipboard. Cut the power, Gary barked to his team. Before Sarah could even wipe the flour from her hands, 2 men in uniforms stormed past the security line and yanked the heavy industrial extension cords from the wall. The bakery plunged into darkness. The hum of the generators died. Hey, Sarah shouted, running to the front. What are you doing? You can't do this. Gary met her at the door. He handed her a bright orange citation. Sarah Miller. He recited robotically. This facility is hereby condemned under City Code 884. Unsanitary water supply, unpermitted electrical modifications, and severe fire hazards. You are ordered to vacate the premises immediately. This is ridiculous, Sarah cried, holding the paper with shaking hands. The wiring is safe. An electrician signed off on it yesterday. This is Adele, isn't it? She sent you. Gary ignored her. He turned to his men. Clear the building. Everyone out. Now. The customers were ushered out, grumbling and shouting at the inspectors. Sarah was the last one to leave. She tried to grab her ledger and her cash box, but an officer blocked her path. Out, ma'am. The building is sealed. Sarah was pushed out onto the sidewalk. She watched in horror as Gary took a heavy padlock and secured the front door. Then, he slapped a massive sticker on the glass. Danger. Red tagged. Do not enter. By order of the city. You can't do this. Sarah screamed, tears streaming down her face. I have to bake. If I don't bake, take it up with the court, Gary muttered, finally looking her in the eye. Until the landlord approves the repairs to bring this up to code, this building stays closed. It was the perfect catch-22. Sarah couldn't reopen until the building was fixed. But James owned the building, and she would never fix it. The next morning, 4th Avenue was silent. The smell of bread was gone. James Adele watched the news from her office with a glass of champagne in her hand. The ticker at the bottom of the screen read, Miller's Hearth shut down by city. Indefinite closure. Day 1. James whispered to herself. She walked over to her wall calendar and drew a red X through the date. The days began to bleed together. Day 5. The crowds outside the bakery dwindled. There was nothing to buy, nothing to see. Day 12. The news cycle moved on. The cameras left. Day 20. A storm hit Seattle, washing away the chalk messages of support on the sidewalk. Sarah Miller seemed to vanish. She gave no interviews. She filed no emergency appeals. The bakery remained dark, cold, and silent. James grew bolder with every passing day. Her stock price stabilized. The investors calmed down. She's given up, James told Leonard over a celebratory dinner on day 25. She realized she can't fight the city. She's probably packing her bags for Florida right now. I don't know, Leonard said, swirling his wine. It's too quiet. Holloway is a smart lawyer. Why haven't they filed for an injunction? Because they're broke. Leonard. James laughed. No bread means no money. No money means no lawyers. We starved her out. Day 29 arrived. It was a Tuesday, gray and rainy. James spent the entire day watching the live security feed of the bakery entrance on her second monitor. She was looking for any sign of life. A flickering light. A movement. Nothing. The red tag on the door was peeling in the rain, but the padlock remained secure. One more day, James murmured. Just 24 hours. She had already prepared the paperwork. She had bribed the clerk at the county records office to process the transfer the second the clock struck midnight on day 30. She had the auction house on speed dial. She wasn't just going to take the land. She was going to bulldoze the entire block by Friday. Day 30 came and went. The sun set on 4th Avenue. The streetlights flickered on. Miller's hearth remained a tomb. At 11:59 p.m., James Adele stood up from her desk. She felt a rush of adrenaline that was better than any drug. It's over, she said. She picked up her phone and dialed Leonard. File the motion, she commanded. The 30 days are up. The enterprise is abandoned. The trust is dead. Get me that title. The atmosphere inside courtroom 4B was heavier than lead. It wasn't just the air conditioning, which seemed to hum with a low, ominous vibration. It was the sheer weight of expectation. 30 days of legal warfare had led to this single hour. James Adele sat at the plaintiff's table, her posture rigid, her chin tilted upward in a defiant angle that she had perfected in boardrooms across Europe. She wore a suit of blinding white, a deliberate choice. It was the color of purity, of vindication. To her, this wasn't a trial. It was a coronation. She had counted the days on her calendar like a child waiting for Christmas. 30 days of silence from the bakery. 30 days of darkness. The law was mathematical, and the math was finally on her side. She looks nervous, James whispered to Leonard Prescott, her eyes darting to the defense table. Sarah Miller did not look like a woman about to lose her legacy. She sat with a stillness that was unnerving. She wasn't wringing her hands. She wasn't crying. She was simply waiting. Beside her, the young lawyer, Emily Holloway, was arranging a stack of documents with the precision of a surgeon preparing for an operation. She's not nervous, Leonard muttered, wiping a bead of sweat from his upper lip. She's resigned. They know they've lost. The statute is clear, James. Abandonment is abandonment. All rise, the bailiff's voice boomed, cutting through the murmurs of the packed gallery. Judge Silas Graves entered. He looked more tired than usual. The wrinkles around his eyes seemed deeper, etched by the strain of a case that had turned into a media circus. He sat down heavily, the leather of his chair creaking in the silence. He didn't look at the lawyers. He spent a long, agonizing minute adjusting his reading glasses, then shuffling the files in front of him. Finally, he looked up. His gaze landed on James. It was cold, neutral, and unreadable. "We are here on an emergency motion filed by Adele Development," Judge Graves rumbled, his voice echoing slightly. "Petition for the dissolution of the Miller Trust via Clause 14B, abandonment of enterprise." He turned his gaze to Leonard Prescott. "Mr. Prescott, the floor is yours. Make it count." Leonard stood, buttoning his jacket with a flourish. He projected confidence, though his hands trembled slightly as he picked up the official report from the health department. "Your Honor," Leonard began, his voice smooth and practiced, "we are not here to debate morality. We are not here to debate history. We are here to execute the letter of the contract. The 1924 Deed of Stewardship is explicit. If the commercial enterprise on the land ceases to operate for 30 continuous days, the stewardship is deemed abandoned, and the title reverts." He walked to the bench and placed a red folder on the judge's desk. "This is the official log from the city health inspector. It confirms that Miller's hearth was red-tagged and shuttered on the 14th of last month. The locks have not been turned. The ovens have not been lit. The cash register inside has not been opened. For 31 days, the land has been commercially dead. Therefore, the trust is broken. We ask the court to immediately transfer the title of the land to the owner of the improvements, Miss James Adele." James allowed herself a small, icy smile. It was done. The trap she had engineered with the health inspector had snapped shut perfectly. Judge Graves opened the folder. He read the report slowly. The silence in the room stretched so thin, it felt like it might snap. "Miss Halloway," the judge said, not looking up, "do you dispute the validity of this report? Was the bakery open?" Emily Halloway stood up. She didn't walk to the podium. She stood behind her chair, gripping the back of it. "Your Honor," she said, her voice clear and surprisingly loud, "we do not dispute that the building was closed. My client was physically barred from entering the structure due to the red tag, a situation created, I might add, by the plaintiff's refusal to repair the electrical grid she owns. The cause of the closure is irrelevant to the timeline," Leonard interrupted smugly. "Closed is closed. However," Emily continued, her voice hardening, "Mr. Prescott is making a fundamental error in his reading of the 1924 deed. He is conflating the structure with the land." James rolled her eyes theatrically for the benefit of the press in the back row. "Here comes the desperate flailing," she thought. "Clause 14B," Emily recited from memory, "states that the commercial enterprise upon the land must not cease. It does not say, inside the building. It does not say, under a roof. It says, quite simply, upon the land." Judge Graves stopped reading. He looked over his glasses at Emily. "Elaborate, counsel." Emily nodded to Sarah. Sarah reached under the table and pulled out a heavy, battered ledger book. It looked like something from another century, bound in worn leather. "Your Honor," Emily said, "the property survey for 402 4th Avenue clearly shows that the Miller plot extends 4 feet beyond the front facade of the building. It includes the concrete patio area directly abutting the public sidewalk. That 4-foot strip is private property. It is part of the trust land." James frowned. What was she talking about? "For the past 31 days, Emily said, Miss Miller has not been inside her bakery. She couldn't be. But every single morning, from 6 a.m. to 10 a.m., regardless of the weather, she stood on that 4-foot strip of concrete." Emily walked to the projector and placed a stack of photographs under the lens. The image appeared on the screen behind the judge. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. The photo showed Sarah Miller, wrapped in a heavy raincoat, standing in the pouring rain in front of the boarded-up bakery. She was standing on the small patio. Beside her was a portable camping table. On the table was a large thermos and a cooler. She was selling coffee, Emily said. Brewed in her apartment, carried down in thermal carafes, and sandwiches, prepared in her home kitchen, wrapped in foil. She flipped to the next photo. It showed a line of people, construction workers, nurses in scrubs, businessmen standing in the rain, handing cash to Sarah. "Day 1, Emily narrated. $11 in sales. Day 12, $40. Day 29, $75. She handed the ledger to the bailiff. These are the transaction logs, Your Honor. Every cup of coffee, every ham sandwich, every single day for the last month, commerce was conducted upon the land. James stood up, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. "This is a joke," she screeched, losing her composure. She was running a lemonade stand on the pavement. That is not a commercial enterprise. That is begging. It is a business. Judge Graves corrected her, his voice sharp. She provided a good. She received payment. She recorded the tax liability. That is the definition of enterprise, Miss Adele. But she was blocking the entrance. Leonard sputtered, grasping at straws. "It is her entrance," the judge snapped. "She owns the ground. She can stand there until doomsday if she chooses." Judge Graves looked at the ledger, then back at James. "The requirement of the trust is to serve the community through commerce. It seems Miss Miller has done exactly that, under extraordinary duress. The motion to dissolve the trust is denied." James felt the blood drain from her face. The room seemed to tilt. "Denied?" she whispered. "But I bought the debt. I own the building. I can wait her out. I have millions." She turned to Sarah, her eyes wide with a manic fury. "You think this is over? I will never fix those wires. I will leave that building as a rotting shell on your precious dirt. You will never bake inside again. I'll let it crumble brick by brick before I let you back in." The courtroom went deadly silent. Even Leonard Prescott took a step away from his client, his eyes wide with horror. Judge Graves was staring at James. He wasn't angry. He looked satisfied. "Miss Adele," the judge said quietly, "did you just state, for the record, that you intend to willfully neglect the structure to prevent Miss Miller from operating?" "Yes," James shouted, her arrogance blinding her to the cliff edge she was standing on. "It's my building. I can do what I want with it. If she won't sell the land, I'll make sure the building is useless to her." Judge Graves nodded slowly. He reached for a separate document that had been sitting at the bottom of his stack. "I'm glad you clarified your position," Graves said, "because Miss Holloway filed a counter-motion this morning that I was hesitant to consider. I thought perhaps it was too aggressive. But you have just confirmed every single allegation in it." James froze. "What counter-motion?" "The motion for forfeiture of leasehold via malicious stewardship," Graves read. "That's not a real thing." James spat. "Oh, it is very real," Graves said. He opened the ancient 1924 deed again, turning to the very back page, a page James's team had deemed irrelevant. The ground lease agreement creates a relationship between the landowner and the building owner. It acts as a partnership. And like all partnerships, it requires good faith. Graves looked over his glasses. Clause 21. Should the tenant of the improvements engage in acts of malicious interference, sabotage, or willful neglect intended to devalue the underlying land or harm the reputation of the trust, the leasehold constitutes a hostile occupation. He paused, letting the words sink in. "The penalty for hostile occupation," Graves continued, his voice rising, "is summary forfeiture. Not a fine, not a warning. Forfeiture." Leonard Prescott dropped his pen. He knew. He knew it was over. "You cut the wires," Graves listed, ticking off on his fingers. "You erected a fence to block access. You called the health inspector to force a closure. And just now, you admitted under oath that your plan is to let the building rot to destroy Miss Miller's livelihood." "Ivor," James stammered. The fire in her belly was suddenly replaced by ice. "You tried to weaponize the property rights, Miss Adele," Graves said, his voice thundering now. "You thought the law was a hammer you could use to smash a woman who couldn't fight back. But the law is also a shield." Judge Graves picked up his gavel. He held it in the air for a moment, savoring the weight of it. "James Adele, the court finds that you have acted in bad faith. You have violated the sanctity of the ground lease. The court rules in favor of the defendant." Bang! The sound was like a gunshot in the quiet room. The leasehold improvement, the structure at 402 4th Avenue, is hereby stripped from Adele Development. Ownership of the building reverts immediately to the land trust. The debt you purchased is dissolved as a penalty for malicious litigation. James gripped the table, her knuckles turning white. You can't do that. I paid $3 million. That's my money. You're stealing my building. I am not stealing it, Judge Graves said, closing the file. You lost it. You gambled on cruelty, and you lost. This is a mistrial, James screamed, her voice cracking. I am James Adele. I own this city. Bailiff, Graves said calmly, please escort the former plaintiff out. She is currently trespassing on Miss Miller's property. 2 uniformed officers stepped forward. James pulled away from them, looking around the room for an ally, for someone to tell her this was a nightmare. But all she saw were the cold eyes of the gallery, the defeated slump of her lawyer, and Sarah Miller. Sarah stood up. She looked across the aisle at the woman who had tried to ruin her. Sarah didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She just looked relieved. An expensive lesson, Sarah said softly, her voice carrying through the silence. I'll sue you, James shrieked as the officers took her by the arms. I'll bury you. The heavy oak doors swung shut behind her, muffling her screams, leaving the courtroom in a stunned, vibrating silence. Judge Graves looked at Sarah. Miss Miller, you have your bakery back. I suggest you get those ovens on. I believe the city has missed your bread. Sarah nodded, tears finally spilling over her cheeks. Yes, Your Honor. Thank you. Conclusion. The downfall of James Adele was swift and brutal. The video of her screaming in the courtroom leaked by a law student in the gallery went viral within hours. It was viewed 10 million times in 2 days. The hashtag #billionaire meltdown trended globally. Investors, spooked by the erratic behavior and the massive loss of capital, fled Adele Development in droves. The board of directors held an emergency meeting on Sunday night. By Monday morning, James Adele was removed as CEO. She was escorted out of her own glass tower by the same security guards she used to intimidate her rivals. She was left with nothing but her designer wardrobe, a ruined reputation, and a massive lawsuit from her own lawyers for unpaid fees. But for Sarah, the victory was sweeter than any pastry she had ever baked. With the court order in hand, the mortgage lien was wiped clean. The debt that had haunted her father for decades was gone. She owned the land, and now, she owned the building free and clear. It took 2 weeks to fix the wiring and clean up the mess James had left. But when Miller's Hearth reopened, it was like a festival. The line of customers wrapped around the block, down 4th Avenue, and around the corner. People didn't just come for the bread. They came to shake the hand of the woman who stood her ground. There was a new item on the menu, sitting proudly in the glass display case next to the cinnamon rolls. It was a small, bitter dark chocolate tart with a hard, brittle shell that cracked easily. It was the most expensive item in the shop. Sarah named it the Adele. It looked perfect on the outside, but it was hollow on the inside and fell apart the moment you applied a little heat. Sarah stood behind the counter, dusting flour off her apron. She watched her customers laughing, eating, and sharing stories. She looked through the front window at the spot on the concrete where she had stood in the rain, selling coffee from a thermos. She touched the old brick wall of the bakery, her wall, on her land. She realized then that her father hadn't just left her a bakery, he had left her a lesson. James Adele had thought power came from what you could take, but Sarah knew the truth. Power comes from what you refuse to give up. Wow. Talk about instant karma. James thought she could use her money and fancy lawyers to bully Sarah, but she ended up handing over a multi-million-dollar building for absolutely free. It just goes to show, you should never underestimate the underdog or the fine print. What do you guys think? Did James deserve to lose everything? Or was the judge's ruling too harsh? I want to hear your thoughts. Let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story of justice served ice cold, please smash that like button, it really helps the channel grow. And don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell notification so you never miss another crazy story of billionaires getting exactly what they deserve. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.